get a real specific message, almost never. And this time I did. And it was quite jarring because it wasn't a particularly happy message, but it's changed the way I'm thinking about things for the last year and a half. And the message was this: don't waste your time. You may not have much left. Now, that was true the day I was born. You don't, any of us have much time left if we're willing to think about it. But this seemed very pointed. It came a few months before I got a diagnosis of prostate cancer.
Hola a todos, bienvenidos a este espacio. Mi nombre es Cristian Jiménez y en esta ocasión les traigo una conversación reciente entre el Dr. Francis Collins y el filósofo Alex O'Connor. Y en esta primera parte discutiremos sus posturas, las evidencias que consideran para la fe, la experiencia personal de Collins con Dios y al final mis comentarios sobre cada uno de los puntos abordados en esta primera parte. Te invito a que nos apoyes suscribiéndote a nuestro canal, dejándonos un comentario y compartiendo este video. Comencemos.
Alex, I thought we would start with you. I've heard you describe yourself as an atheist, but most recently I was watching an interview, you said violently agnostic about God's existence. So what's your current position and how did you arrive there?
In the online atheist community, atheism is sometimes defined as just a lack of belief in God. It's actually something that's pressed quite a lot. People have wasted a lot of ink over this particular question of what it means. And so I think when I was calling myself a hardcore atheist, I would have been the kind of atheist that says, well, I just lack a belief in God, and that's all atheism is. I find that the agnostic label is a bit more accurate when I'm sort of having general conversations with people to explain where I'm at, which is I obviously can't say that God doesn't exist. Interestingly, when somebody says, well, I know you say you're an atheist, but do you know that God doesn't exist? Or are you technically an agnostic? Fine. But a lot of the time when I speak to a Christian or a theist, and I say, but do you know that God exists? Like, are you certain about it? And they go, well, no, I'm not certain, but I believe it. And I wouldn't say, oh, well, technically you're an agnostic then. Because really what you're saying is sort of, what side broadly do you fall on here? And for me, when observing the world around me, I find so many inexplicable mysteries. So I have to die on that fence of agnosticism, as I put it before. But if you ask me to sort of place a bet, I think that I'm at least suspicious of the idea that this is compatible with a traditional creator type figure. And so I'd sort of fall in that camp. But strictly speaking, I have no idea. And sorry to disappoint, but I'm not sure we'll get to the bottom of the question today.
Oh,
yeah.
We'll counting on that.
We'll do the best that we can.
How would you, obviously in the early 2000s, New Atheism, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harrison, Christopher Hitchens, how would you differentiate the way you think about this question versus maybe the way that they would have thought about this question, if at all?
Well, New Atheism is made up of two components: that God doesn't exist and that religion is evil. There's nothing new about atheism. People haven't believed in God for just about as long as they have. Humanity, I mean. The thing that's different about the New Atheists is that they came along and they did the sociological analysis and sort of like, people don't believe in God anymore. This isn't really part of our culture. But they said, but we don't need it because you can regain your spiritual autonomy and we can ground our ethics in secular humanism and the virtues of, if it's Christopher Hitchens, Thomas Paine and the American founding fathers. And that, I think, is where I have to depart company because I think that saying religion is bad is like saying politics is bad. It's kind of, I get why someone would say that, it's kind of true, but it's a little bit naive of a statement. It doesn't mean that there isn't a correct political position. I could say that politics has caused all kinds of wars and politics has driven people apart, and that's true. But it'd be naive to say, therefore, we can throw off politics and all be anarchists. You can still think that there's a correct political position, or that having or developing a better relationship with politics and a more thought-out political view would help that problem. But to sort of throw it out altogether, I think is maybe a mistake. The trouble I find myself in is that I can't say, religion is terrible and evil and we're better off without it, but I just don't believe that it's true.
Yeah.
And so I can't lie to my children for want of a better society. So I'm in a bit of a tough spot. I'm agnostic as well on that question, in other words. Whereas they would say religion is bad, I would say I don't know. I think it's probably too simplistic an analysis.
Well, I appreciate your channel and the curiosity that you bring to each episode. And I could really feel that and feel even what you're saying right now. And so I think that's a very interesting way to go about it. Francis, what about you? What's your current position and how'd you arrive there?
I appreciate what Alex is saying, that sometimes we try to put these categories of belief or non-belief into very specific subsets. Maybe we trichotomize it. You're an atheist or you're agnostic or you're a believer. I think it's really much more of a spectrum. And I think I've traveled across that spectrum during my whole life and not found it like I was jumping from one box to the other. It was sort of sliding along and then going, well, maybe not, and then this way. So let me tell you how it started. I was born in a family about 3 hours from here in Virginia. My dad was a college professor. My mother was a playwright. We lived on a farm that had no indoor plumbing. There was no interest in faith in my childhood upbringing. It wasn't denigrated. It just wasn't considered to be relevant or important. It was all about music and theater and the arts and literature and a bit of history. I did not go to public school until the 6th grade, and not for religious reasons. It's because my parents thought they were better teachers than what was available in the public schools in that county. And they were right. So I learned a lot from my mom and dad, particularly about the joy of learning new things, which I carry with me my whole life. But I didn't learn a thing about what religion was all about or whether God exists. So in that spectrum where atheism's over here and really strong, no doubt in your mind belief is over here, I was undefined. And then I landed in college, and you know how it is, those 2:00 in the morning discussions where, what do you believe and what do you believe? I thought the atheist had the better hand in those conversations and decided, okay, I'll throw myself in with that lot. So I was an atheist, left college, went to graduate school, studied quantum mechanics, loved mathematics, loved the beauty of science, that equations could describe things. It didn't occur to me that might not have been the obvious outcome for the universe, but I was completely focused on what you could call scientism, that any question that was worth asking was a scientific question, and any question that couldn't be answered that way was off the table. And then I had this change in my life plan about exactly where I wanted my professional career to go. I was a little bit disillusioned with the abstractness of what I was doing in quantum mechanics, even though it was kind of fun, and felt this urge to do something more directly connected to people. And so I went to medical school, which was quite a 180-degree turn scientifically from where I had been, thinking that life science was just much too messy. By the way, it is, but it mattered. And I entered medical school as an atheist over here on this end of the spectrum. And I left kicking and screaming, having crossed over all of those intermediates and landed somewhere over here as a Christian, but a Christian who had lots of questions and lots of doubts, but who had made the decision that this is true enough for me to throw myself into it and to have this be my foundation until there's some reason not to. And that was 47 years ago, and I'm still a Christian. And I have, waffled around a little bit over there on that end of the spectrum, depending on what kind of challenges come along. But the more I get deep into what the real foundation of that faith is, and particularly the person of Jesus, that's now such an anchor to the way I think about everything that I can't really imagine walking away from it. Can I prove it? No. Do I believe it? Yes.
Well, I think as we embark on this conversation, it's important to define terms. You said, "Can I prove it?" And you spoke about truth a lot in your latest book, and so you seem to make a distinction. I think this is important when we talk about God's existence because we throw around the term evidence. So you make a distinction between proof and evidence. So how would you differentiate those terms?
I think that's really important. The book I wrote 18 years ago about my own faith journey called The Language of God, the subtitle is A Scientist Presents Evidence for Belief, not proof. I don't think God intended for us to have proof. If there was, we would all be running around being good little believers, following what is incontrovertible evidence that we absolutely have to accept this. I think God had in mind something much more interesting and something that called more to us to make a decision, not to have it forced upon you by some mathematical proof. And maybe, what is it, Eugene Peterson said, if God wanted us to have a mathematical proof, it would have been tough to say, I love you in algebra. There's a lot more here than what you would call that sort of a proof. So I do think there's evidence, and I can tick off a few of the things that appealed to me as I was kicking and screaming, giving up my atheism and ultimately my agnosticism, because I didn't want to recognize that there was a lot here that was hard to dismiss. Some of it, of course, is the nature of the universe and how it's put together, and we may end up talking about that.
Yeah, we will.
The fact that the universe did have a beginning, and that seems to cry out for a cause. Here we are in Kalam. And that it has this remarkable fine-tuning of all these constants that even the astronomer Martin Rees, who's not a believer, that wonderful book he wrote about 6 numbers, seemed to have had the dial set in an exquisitely careful way in order for there to be anything interesting here, and not just a bunch of particles. So, of course, the retreat from that is the multiverse option, which is an option, but seems to me require at least as much faith as the one that says, actually, there's an intelligence behind this that explains, Maxwell's equations, that are the way in which electricity and magnetism operate. Simple, beautiful equations. As somebody who used to be in that field, first encountering Maxwell's equations, it's like, wow, this is like watching an incredible work of art being generated. Why should that be? It does seem to cry out for an intelligence. And of course, Einstein would have agreed with that part. Now we're just talking about deism, not theism. The theist part, for me, a lot of it comes down to the moral law, the idea that there's good and evil. And the ability to try to explain that purely on the basis of evolutionary psychology falls short of me. It doesn't explain the kind of radical altruism that we as humans tend to admire when we see it, and which is sometimes a scandal to evolution. Why should that be? So the moral law, and then the whole phenomenon of beauty. I don't find it easy to dismiss experiences that sort of lift me out of myself, which for me is often music. This exquisite longing, poignant longing that's inspired in your whole being by a particular beautiful piece of music. It feels like it's some kind of an outreach to your very soul. And I don't know how to explain that on the basis of neuroscience, although I imagine neuroscience will find there is some properties of the brain that supports it. So again, not a proof, but for me at 27, having walked down this trail bit by bit, realizing that my arguments of strict atheism really couldn't be sustained, I got to that place where I had to decide whether to take the leap. There was no going back. That had already crumbled behind me. The only real alternative was to stay in this awkward, uncertain space, or to say, okay, I find it no longer possible to stay there and to resist.
Yeah, that's good.
Trust you, God, to meet me on the other side of that gap.
Yeah, you spoke a lot of different areas, philosophical arguments, science. I'm curious how you go about this process. You had a couple videos on your YouTube channel, arguments for atheism and arguments for theism as well. And so I'm just curious to unpack your mind on how you think about this in terms of evidence and reason and all that stuff.
Yeah, well, when I say that I'm violently agnostic, I'm talking about the existence of God. I don't know what God is. I don't know what this word is supposed to refer to, right? And I remember for some reason this stuck out to me. I was speaking to somebody once who's not really into philosophy or science or anything. And we were just talking and he sort of said, I don't believe in God, and carried on talking. And something about the way he said it, I just thought to myself, what is the thing that you have in your head when you say that? What is the referent for the word God there? What is the thing that you don't believe in? The cliche is for the Christian to find out and say, well, guess what? I don't believe in that God either, whatever it is that you have in mind. But it's true, because God is, if we listen to the way that God is described in Scripture, but also in the traditional philosophical schools of thought, it's not the man in the sky, but it's also not like a creative mind. I mean, Aquinas would say that God is not even powerful. God is not like loving. God is not knowing. God is not any of those things, because those are all just analogous terms that somewhat approximate the kind of thing that God might be like, right? And so if there is a God, I think it's sort of far beyond comprehension. And so my agnosticism is partly due to that. I think that without the guidance of some form of scripture, the reason we know that we can use these analogies accurately, even if we can't understand the thing they point to, is because we have it on the authority of someone like Jesus. The problem is that my agnosticism doesn't extend to religious traditions like Christianity. Those I unfortunately do think are false. At the very least, I don't think there's good enough evidence to believe in the truth claims of Christianity, the crucial parts of the resurrection, for example. That's a sticking point for a lot of people. That brings a lot of people to faith. It doesn't do it for me. Also, the moral qualms, the same moral intuition that I'm told I'm supposed to rely upon to prove the existence of God, is that same moral intuition that I'm supposed to ignore when I encounter the less than enviable situations of the Canaanites,
the Old
or
Testament,
Hebrew slaves or non-Hebrew slaves, to make things worse. But also in the New Testament, the treatment of women is something that raises a lot of eyebrows. Interestingly, I think the atheist has an escape route there, because I think that Paul didn't write a lot of what we find attributed to Paul in the New Testament, but that's not really an option for the New Testament trusting Christian. So I'm sort of the one who can absolve Paul here. I don't think he wrote those words in 1 Corinthians where he says that women should, if they have a question, they should go home and ask their husbands. It's a disgrace to them to speak in church. I don't think he wrote those words, and I think we have good evidence to think he didn't. I don't think he wrote the entire book of 1 Timothy. And so a lot of those problems sort of go away for me. But if I'm looking at the Christian religion, that moral intuition that so powerfully tells people, well, you know certain things are right or wrong. You know it. Even if you want to sort of try to psychologize it or talk about evolution or anything, you know somewhere that there's a moral feeling that certain things are right or wrong. And even if I say, okay, sure, yeah, great. So what does that mean I should do? Well, that should lead you to Christianity. And then the first thing I see opening that book is something which contradicts the very moral intuition that I was supposed to use to get there in the first place. That leaves me with some cause for concern. When it comes to the actual existence of God, the fine-tuning and the first cause type stuff, I'm kind of okay with this. What are we thinking about God as being? If we think of God as someone who's sort of like finely tuning constants, the strong and weak nuclear forces and the gravitational constant, sort of like almost like typing them all into a computer or something, then we're starting to imagine God as more of this sort of intervening agency, which is what I was trying to avoid before. I do have specific responses to each of these arguments, by the way. So like the fine tuning, or the first cause stuff, whatever, which we can do. Yeah. But just as a broad overview, I find it impossible to really say what would count as evidence or proof of God's existence, because I don't even know what this God figure is. Yeah. But I do know that the religious traditions that have sprung up in response to apprehension of the divine have given me cause for concern.
Yeah, I mean, well, Francis was talking about faith being a spectrum. I think also looking at this question and zooming out, and I do want to zoom out because if you subscribe to a particular belief system like Christianity, there are things from the Bible that we learn about God, right? But I think a lot of people are in this place of, like you're talking about, agnosticism, where, even if fine-tuning were true, like, does that necessarily indicate that that is the Christian version of the God? And so we have, atheism, agnosticism, then we have maybe deism or theism, which is like a more detached picture with deism of maybe a creator, but isn't necessarily this loving depiction of God seen through Jesus. And so I kind of want to work through each of those individual points. And so you both mentioned the fine-tuning of the universe.
So people come to believe for all kinds of reasons, right? There are people who say that they come to believe in God. Lee Strobel is a good example of this, someone who seems to just investigate the evidence for the resurrection, and that's what does it. But I think that's not the most usual case. I think more commonly people come to believe in God for other reasons, for moral reasons, for social reasons, or because it speaks to them in a way that they can't quite explain. And then they come to the Gospels with this sense that they know it's true and they sort of want to learn more about it, right? And I think that is perfectly legitimate. But of course, in my sort of worldview here, as an atheist or someone who doesn't believe in Christianity and the resurrection of Jesus, when somebody comes to me and says, well, then hold on, what about this historical case for the resurrection, that's where I kind of have to get a bit nitpicky, because I'm like, okay, well, if you're going to confront me with evidence for the resurrection, then I'm going to say, well, what about this, and what about this, and what about this? But I totally understand that as a personal quest to understand, the nature of Christianity and coming to know Jesus as a Christian, this is probably like an inappropriate approach to that, right? But as somebody who's confronted with the evidence, that's the approach that one has to take.
I think I got to ask you then: is the path towards making a decision about belief or non-belief, is that a totally rational path, or is there room for revelation?
Oh, I think if I experienced revelation, I think that could be a kind of rational. Depends what you mean by rational. But if, like, what do you mean? Do you mean, will it be purely like argumentative?
Oh, no. I mean, there are certainly people who come to faith on a purely emotional basis. I had this experience. I realized God is real. Jesus spoke to me. I honor that. I recognize that. That's not happened to me. But I have had those moments of feeling like there is something more than I can explain that seems to be part of a relationship that I am trying to build on and often wondering if it's there, but once in a while it is. I'll tell you a story. Just a year and a half ago, as I'm praying about a book I had read, which was about sort of the kind of spiritual discipline that one ought to utilize if you're really going to get yourself closer to an understanding of what your faith is all about. And praying about that and realizing I'm not very disciplined in my faith. And my prayer life, Alex, is mostly a seeking of understanding of something I'm wrestling with. And the skeptic would say, well, that's fine. We should all do that. And so it's just in your head. But it feels like more than that. It feels like it's an opportunity to get some incoming insights that I maybe can't quite manage on my own. And I almost never get a real specific message, almost never. And this time I did. And it was quite jarring because it wasn't a particularly happy message, but it's changed the way I'm thinking about things for the last year and a half. And the message was this: don't waste your time. You may not have much left. Now, that was true the day I was born. You don't, any of us have much time left if we're willing to think about it. But this seemed very pointed. It came a few months before I got a diagnosis of prostate cancer, so maybe that was part of the premonition of what lie ahead. But it's really affected me that this is a message that requires attention and that I don't think just came out of my own head, because it's not one I would have chosen, but it's a calling of some sort, and not to put yourself in a place where days go by and you're just spending your time on things that really don't matter. Invest in relationships, especially loving relationships. Invest in things that might alleviate the suffering that you and I both worry a lot about. In my case, as a doctor, and human suffering. Invest in ways that maybe could bring people back together at a time where we all seem so divided and mad at each other about everything. It has that effect. Now, again, that was revelation. That was not I sat down and did a logical experiment here and figured out that was the message I need to hear, and then I had it. It's like, whoa, surprised me. That's what I mean by revelation. My coming to faith had some of those moments as well, where I could reason myself close to the answer, but it required something more than that to actually take the leap. And I guess coming back to you, because I want to turn the tables on you, what kind of that revelation have you had, or would it take for you to put aside all of the rational arguments, which clearly lead you in this direction, but doesn't sound to me like you're 100% sure you're right. And can you imagine such a thing that would change your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I would love for that to happen. I mean, I don't know exactly what it's like. I was going to ask you a question. I don't want to sort of answer your question with a question, but like, what does it feel like, or what did it feel like to be sat there praying, and there are thoughts flittering through your head, and you're thinking about taking out the trash, and then there's this one thought that appears in your head that you feel sort of isn't yours. and how it is that you identify. I mean, you said a moment ago that it's because it feels like the kind of thought that you wouldn't have had or wanted to have. So there's that, but like, I don't know, does it strike you? Do you hear it? Do you see it? You know, what?
I felt it.
Mm-hmm.
The words were very explicit. It wasn't like a nebulous kind of idea. It was those specific words. Don't waste your time. You may not have much left.
Mm-hmm.
And it did not make sense for this to be something that my mind was likely to have come up with, because it was not what I wanted to hear as I'm in the middle of that prayer moment, which was a serious prayer moment. I was reasonably well focused, not expecting this.
Yeah. Well, I can say that if I had that kind of experience, I don't know if I had that experience in isolation that I would sort of believe in God, just because I've heard some kind of thought that maybe if the nature of the thought was different, if the nature of the thought was distinctly like, here I am, something like that, then if I sort of heard a voice, so to speak, that said something like, you know, don't waste your time, you might not have much left, or said something like, you should spend more time with your mother, or something like that, then I would think that'd probably, like, you know, increase my credence in God's existence to some minimal degree. But I'd consider it this sort of happy mystery. If the nature of the message was theological in tone, and it struck me with that kind of surprise and intrigue, then I would absolutely, I would love for that to happen. I really would, and I wouldn't rule it out. And I think that one of the most legitimate ways to come to believe in God, if not the most legitimate way, is through sort of personal experience and revelation. It's not the kind of thing that's going to convince another person. That's why it's laughed out of the room in debates. If you're doing a public debate with somebody, like if we were here having a debate and you were trying to sort of convince me that God existed, and you said, well, I had this sort of message from God, then everyone would laugh you out of the room, because that's not going to convince anybody. But that's not supposed to convince anybody. As far as it's convincing you, it's like the most legitimate way imaginable.
That's right.
To come to believe in God. And so, of course, and so when people asked me, you know, what would it take, I would highly doubt that I would be reading the Blackwell Companions to Natural Theology, and I'd be on objection to subheading 3 to the modal ontological argument. I don't think that one's in there actually, but maybe like the Leibnizian cosmological argument. And I go like, there, and I get out my pen, I underline it. I'm like, there he is, found it. You know, I don't think that's how it's going to happen.
It's hiding there,
right? Exactly. And also there's a kind of it's kind of elitism that comes along with that kind of thought, which is that if you have the time and the intellect and the studious sort of intellectual constitution and the schooling and whatnot, that you can understand this argument, and you've got the money to buy the book and the time to sit down and read it, and that's how you come to believe in God. If that's how you're supposed to come to believe in God, then that would make God a pretty unfair administrator of his love, right? And so it's clear that that's not how it's supposed to be done.
Brings to mind Matthew 11, Jesus' words, I thank you, or I praise you, God, that you have hidden these things from the wise and revealed them to little children. And he's talking about the awareness of faith and its reality.
Yes.
So we've been talking about things that maybe appeals to the wise, but I'm not sure.
Having said that, I'm sure that God meets you where you're at, as they say. And of course, if God is everywhere and God pervades the natural world, then of course you will find him in the biological cell, and you will find him in the galaxies and the laws of the universe and whatnot.